No one touches the Black Wolf of the North after battle. A healer tried it once. He woke 3 days later, unable to remember his own name. That is what his aura does to a trained hand. Now imagine an untrained one. Imagine a maid from the lower wing, the kind of girl no one in that citadel could pick out of a crowd of 10. Imagine her walking toward his door while men twice her size were walking away from it. This morning, the court found her asleep on his chest. Not dead, not screaming. Asleep, her cheek against his heart, like the safest place in the kingdom was the ribs of a monster. The Alpha King has looked at grown generals and made them flinch. He looked at his own council today and said 4 words. Wake her and die. No one has ever heard him protect anything softer than a border. And outside these walls, in the frozen streets of the lower city, the bells have already started ringing on their own. The kingdom is afraid of her. He is not. So the question the whole court is choking on this morning is the only question that matters. What happens when the one person who can calm a cursed king is the one person his own crown should never have let live? Dawn came into the throne hall the color of a bruise, blue-black and swelling at the edges, and it found the room exactly as the night had left it. Frozen, silent, wrong. Frost feathered the obsidian pillars where the carved wolves stood eternal watch, their stone jaws catching the pale light. On the long council table, 3 silver goblets sat tipped at angles no cup should hold. Wine suspended mid-spill in threads of ice, as though time itself had flinched and stopped breathing along with everyone else in the room. Guards stood at the walls. With their hands on sword hilts they did not dare draw. Nobles who had arrived for a dawn council now stood, pressed against the cold stone, not one of them stepping closer than they had to, because in the great chair at the head of the hall, the obsidian throne carved from a mountain that no longer existed, sat Torrin Blackfrost, Alpha King of the North, with dried blood cracking along his collar and a maid asleep against his chest. She had one hand curled loosely near his heart, fingers slack in sleep, her golden hair fallen across the leather of his jerkin like something spilled and forgotten. Her sleeve had ridden up in the night. On the inside of her wrist, pale and thin, a crescent scar caught the frostlight. No one in that hall had ever seen the Black Wolf of the North allow a hand within 3 feet of his skin unbruised. Yet here she lay, breathing slow and even, while the most dangerous man north of the White River sat motionless beneath her, one arm curved around her back like a wall, built purely to keep the cold out. He had not moved in an hour. He would not move for 3 more. When the young court healer, barely into his robes, finally found his voice, it came out smaller than he meant it to. How is she still alive? No one answered him. No one had an answer. To understand it, you would have to go back to the night before, to a storm inside a man, and a girl who walked toward it instead of away. The ambush had come at the tree line, where the border patrol always thinned, where 3 of his own guard had died before Torrin even reached them, and where something silver-tipped had opened his side to the bone. He rode back through the gates of Frosthold Citadel half out of his own skin. Quite literally, his jaw already lengthening, claws pushing through fingertips that should have stayed human, black veins crawling up both forearms like ink dropped into water. The bracer on his right arm had torn loose somewhere on the ride. He did not remember losing it. He remembered only the cold, and the curse beneath the cold, clawing up from wherever it lived in him and asking, as it always asked, to be let out all the way. The guards who carried him in did not carry him far. They set him down at the base of the tower stairs and backed away the way men back away from a fire that has just found the roof. 2 healers came. One took a single look at the black lines spreading past his elbow, at the low, continuous sound coming from his chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a man's voice, and found urgent business elsewhere in the castle. The second made it 3 steps into the tower room before the pressure of him, the raw, wrong-weather feeling of a wolf losing the argument with his own curse, put her on her knees in the corridor, gasping, unable to go further. By midnight, the tower held only him and the storm, and no one willing to open that door. Isla Fenwick opened it. She had spent her evening the way she spent every evening, hauling water up 4 flights for baths. She would never take herself, her wrists raw and pink from the buckets, her sleeves already rolled to keep them dry. She had heard the commotion from the servants' stare, the ambush, the king's return, the healers fleeing, and she had done what she always did when something in the castle bled. She filled a basin with hot water, found clean linen, and walked toward the one door everyone else in Frosthold was walking away from. The corridor outside his chamber was empty of guards by the time she reached it, which should have told her something. It told her nothing. She knocked once, out of habit more than hope, and when no answer came, she went in anyway, because the water in her basin was already cooling and a wound does not wait for permission. The room was dark and wrong-shaped with shadow. The storm outside throwing lightning through the high window in long blue strikes. He was on the floor near the hearth, more animal than man. In that instant, his back arched, his breath coming out as smoke on the cold air, black veins pulsing bright, beneath skin gone the color of old snow. A healer's instinct is to see danger and step back. Isla's instinct had never worked that way. She had spent a childhood tending things too wounded to know a gentle hand from a threatening one, half-drowned dogs, birds with broken wings, a girl once at the edge of a well who wanted only for someone to stay. She set the basin down without a sound and knelt an arm's length from a curse the entire citadel had fled. "You're bleeding on the good rug," she said, because it was the only thing in her head that was not a scream, and something in the room. The air itself, the low, unbearable pressure of him, seemed to still at the sound of her voice. He turned his head. His eyes, when they found her, were more wolf than man, molten gold with no bottom to them. She did not look away. She dipped the linen in the water and pressed it, without asking, to the gash along his ribs, and the growl building in his chest broke apart into something closer to breath. By the time the storm outside had spent itself, so had the one inside him. The black veins receded to a thin line beneath his skin. His jaw settled back into a man's jaw. He did not remember falling asleep sitting upright against the cold stone hearth, her small weight tucked against his chest, where his heart had finally slowed. He remembered only that for the first time since the curse had taken root in his blood, the storm had gone quiet, and it had gone quiet because of her hands. Which is how the court found them at dawn, and why the healers whisper, "How is she still alive?" hung in that frozen hall with no one able to answer it. Until the king himself opened his eyes, looked down at the sleeping girl on his chest, and said the only thing that made any sense to him in that moment, "Wake the maid on my chest, and you die." Then he closed his eyes again and let her sleep. News like that does not stay inside stone walls. By the second morning, half the servants' wing knew a lower maid had slept unharmed on the Black Wolf's chest, and the other half refused to believe it until they saw her walking the halls themselves, unbruised, uneaten, carrying linens as though the world had not tilted sideways beneath her feet. Isla did not feel changed. She still hauled water. She still scrubbed floors that no one thanked her for scrubbing. The only difference was the way people looked at her now. Not with the usual castle blindness reserved for lower servants, but with something sharper, something closer to fear, as if she had grown a second shadow overnight. Orin, the royal healer, found her before the king did. He was a narrow man built like a much-used ledger, ink permanently under his nails, and he studied her the way he studied everything, twice, as if the first look was only a draft. "You should not be alive," he told her, not unkindly. "I have seen trained warriors lose their minds within his radius during the shift. You slept. I didn't ask his permission." Isla said, "I don't think the wound cared who held the linen." Orin's eyes went briefly to her wrist where her sleeve had slipped again, and something crossed his face, recognition, quickly swallowed, before he said only, "Keep your sleeves down, girl. Court eyes are unkind eyes," and walked away faster than a man his age should be able to walk. She did keep her sleeves down after that, mostly from habit. The scar had drawn stares her whole life, ever since she could remember. A thin crescent moon pressed into her skin like a brand no one had ever explained to her. Her mother had died when she was small enough that the memory was mostly smell, wood smoke, wet wool, and the orphan keepers who raised her afterward had never known where the scar came from either, or claimed not to. She had stopped asking a long time ago. Some silences, she had learned, are easier to live inside than to break. The summons came from the king himself, 2 days later, delivered by a guard who would not meet her eyes. Royal assignment, the parchment said, in a hand too careful to be casual. She was to attend the king's chamber daily, to change his dressings, to be near should the curse rise again in the night. No one used the word hostage. No one needed to. She went anyway because refusing a king's order was not a freedom lower maids were given, and because, though she would not have admitted this to anyone, least of all herself, some part of her wanted to see if the storm she had touched once would recognize her hands a second time. It did. The bandage changes became a kind of ritual neither of them named. He would sit in the chair by the window, shirt open at the collar, the long gash along his ribs, healing slower than a wolf's wounds should, the curse eating at his body's own ability to mend itself. She would kneel beside him with clean linen and a jar of orange salve that smelled of pine resin and something bitter beneath it, and for the length of those minutes, the Alpha King of the North, the man whole packs feared to stand near, sat still under a servant's hands like something long tired of being strong. "You should sleep more," she told him once, pressing the linen flat over new stitches. "You look like a man who hasn't in a season." "I am the king," he said. "The North does not sleep because I am tired. The North will notice less than you think if you rest an hour." She did not look up from the bandage. Kingdoms survive their king's naps. They rarely survive their king collapsing in council. He almost laughed. It came out as a breath instead, low and surprised, as if laughter itself were a muscle he had let atrophy. "You argue like a woman who has never lost an argument to a king." "I've never had one worth losing," she said, and tied off the linen, and did not see the way his mouth curved, briefly, before he schooled it flat again. It was in those small hours that he began noticing things about her he had no right, as a king, to notice. The particular way she hummed without realizing it while she worked, low and off-key, some tune she likely didn't know she still remembered. The 2 faint calluses on her palm from years of buckets. The fact that she never flinched from his eyes even when they went gold. Even when the black veins pulsed visible beneath the skin of his forearm before he could hide them under the leather bracer he wore even in council now, out of a vanity he had not owned before her, and there was the wrist. He saw it first on the 3rd day, when her sleeve rode up reaching for the salve jar, a thin crescent scar, old and pale, exactly the shape of a moon caught mid-wane. His whole body went still around it, the way still water goes still around a stone dropped from a height. He had seen that mark before, not on her. On a medallion, once, in his father's private records, half-burned, kept because his father kept everything that reminded him of what he had done and needed to look at. He said nothing. He watched her tuck her sleeve back down without noticing his stillness, and he told himself, the way men tell themselves many convenient things, that there would be time later to speak of it. There was always time later, until there was not. The court's fear did not sit still while the king's tenderness grew. Whispers moved through frost-hold, the way cold moves through stone. Invisible, constant, finding every crack. Servants who had known Isla for years now crossed corridors to avoid her shadow. In the temple district of the lower city, incense burned longer into the night than usual, and High Priest Cassian Mir began speaking, in careful sermons that never quite named her, of old curses returning through unlikely doors. 28 days after the night of the ambush. Isla would count them precisely afterward. The way people count the days before a wound and the days after, 3 of the council's finest horses were found dead at the southern gate, throats untouched, no blood spent, simply dead in their stalls as if something had reached into them and stopped their hearts from the inside. Carved into the stable wall in letters too deep to have been made quickly, someone had written, "The curse wakes because the servant still breathes." The stable boy who found them was 14, a thin, shivering thing named Wick, and by the time the guards reached him, he had not stopped shaking long enough to speak in full sentences. "I didn't hear anything," he kept saying, over and over, his breath fogging white in the cold. "I didn't hear anything. I swear it. I would have heard something, wouldn't I? Wouldn't I have heard something?" No one had an answer for him either. By nightfall, the words on that stable wall had traveled faster than any royal decree ever had, whispered from kitchen to chapel to market stall, until the whole lower city knew there was a cursed girl inside the citadel, and that the horses had been only a warning of what she carried with her. The story stopped, from that morning on, being about a maid asleep in the wrong bed. It became about a kingdom remembering how to be afraid and looking for somewhere to put that fear that was not its own reflection. Fire came next, 11 days later, in the temple district itself. A granary set alight in the dead of night. 3 families put out into the cold before dawn, no lives lost but plenty of blame to spread, and by the time Isla walked the lower market the following week for salve ingredients Oren needed, she felt the eyes on her the way you feel weather changing in your bones. An old woman spat near her feet. A child was pulled indoors by his mother with a speed that had nothing to do with the cold. Someone, somewhere behind her, murmured the word curse, loud enough to be heard and quiet enough to deny it later. The temple bells rang unbidden 3 nights running after that, at the deep black hour, when no hand should have been near the ropes. A slow, tolling sound that carried across the whole city and woke half of it in a cold sweat. High Priest Mir stood before his congregation the morning after the 3rd ringing. His crimson robes catching candlelight, his voice pitched low and grave in the scripture cadence that had made men twice his size lower their eyes. "The bells do not ring themselves," he told them. "They ring because something in this city has remembered who to grieve, and a curse remembers grief the way a wolf remembers blood." He did not say her name. He never needed to. By the time he finished speaking, half the temple was already certain who he meant, and the certainty spread through Frosthold's lower streets like the incense that always seemed to arrive in a room a moment before he did. Clinging, sweet, impossible to wash out of the air once it had settled. The court's fear had become permission. That is the part no one wanted to say plainly, but everyone understood it in their bones. A frightened kingdom does not ask whether the thing it fears is guilty. It only asks how quickly the fear can be answered. It was Oren who broke the silence first, and he broke it with a chained iron case that had sat, by his own account, beneath 3 locked floors of the royal archive for longer than Isla had been alive. He came to Torin's chamber at an hour too late for any ordinary business, his face the particular gray of a man who has decided something difficult and can no longer undecide it. He set the case on the table between them and looked, for a long moment, only at the king. "You already suspect," he said. "I have watched you not say it for 3 weeks. I am done watching." He opened the case. Inside, on a bed of moth-eaten velvet, lay a single medallion, tarnished silver, stamped with a crescent moon, and beside it sealed letters, a genealogical scroll gone brittle at the folds, and a royal decree bearing the seal of the old king, Torin's father, dated a generation past. "House Fenwick," Oren said, and the name landed in the room like a dropped stone. The Moonrest bloodline. The only line in the north whose touch has ever been recorded to quiet a black frost curse rather than provoke it. Your father knew what they carried. He feared it more than he ever feared an enemy with a blade. because a blade can be met and a bloodline cannot be unmade by fighting it. So he did not meet it, he erased it. Every household bearing that name, put to the sword or the fire, in the space of one winter, a generation ago. He kept this case because your father kept every sin he was proud enough to remember and ashamed enough to hide. Isla, who had been standing near the door with a tray of linens she had forgotten she was holding, set it down with hands that had gone perfectly, dangerously still. There was one child unaccounted for, Oren went on, quieter now, watching her instead of the king. An infant smuggled out before the purge reached her cradle. The records say she was lost to the cold within the season. The records, in this case, were wrong. He reached into the case and drew out a small strip of vellum, and on it was drawn, in faded ink, the exact shape of a crescent scar. "It is not decoration," he said. "It is a birthmark unique to that bloodline, appearing always on the left wrist, always in the shape of the moon at its waning. I have suspected since the morning she survived the king's shift unharmed. I confirmed it the week she came under your care, your grace, when I saw the mark myself and said nothing, because I did not yet know which truth was more dangerous, the one where she knew what she was, or the one where she did not." Isla looked down at her own wrist, at the scar she had covered with sleeves. Her whole life, without ever knowing its shape, had a name, and then she looked up. Not at Oren, but at Torin. She watched his face for something she needed to be surprised. She did not find it. There was recognition there instead, old and unhidden, now that hiding it no longer served any purpose. And beneath the recognition, guilt sitting exactly where it had always been sitting, patient, unspoken, worn like the bracer on his arm. "You knew," she said. It was not a question. Her voice did not rise. It simply went very quiet, the way the room had gone quiet the night she first touched his storm and made it still. "You saw it. Days ago. You said nothing. Isla, you let me kneel at your ribs every evening and change your bandages with the hands of the girl your father's men were sent to kill, and you said nothing." She was not shouting. That was, somehow, worse. "I have spent my whole life not asking about a scar no one would explain to me. I thought that was patience. I did not know it was you, letting me stay patient, because the truth was inconvenient to your comfort. I was going to tell you. When? Flat, final, before or after the kingdom decided to burn me for it." He had no answer that would not sound, even to his own ears, like the very cowardice she had just named. He said nothing, which was, in the end, the same thing he had been saying for 3 weeks. And she turned and walked out of the chamber before he could find a better one. Oren watched the door close behind her and looked, for a long moment, at the king who ruled half a continent and had just lost an argument to silence itself. "Your father built an empire out of things unsaid," the old healer said quietly, gathering his case. "I had hoped you'd inherited less of him than that. What none of them saw, not Isla in her fury, not Torin in his guilt, not even Oren with his ledgers and his second copies, was the alley 3 streets from the temple. 2 nights later, where a hooded figure passed a purse, heavy with silver, into the waiting hand of a man who spoke loudly, and often to crowds outside the granary's burned shell. The incense clung to the hooded figure's robes even in the open air, sweet and unmistakable, arriving in that alley a full breath before the man himself did. "The bells again tonight," the agitator said, low, counting the coin by feel in the dark. "The bells will ring as long as the treasury requires them to," said the hooded man, and beneath the hood, for just a moment, candlelight from a distant window caught the edge of a smile, the particular silk-soft smile of a man who has never once raised his voice to make a threat land. Lord Edric Vane did not believe in curses. He believed, with the clean-eyed devotion of a man counting profits, that a king distracted by fear was a king easily managed, and a council frightened enough would hand its king's authority to whoever offered them calm in exchange for it. The priest's faith was useful. The priest's faith cost him nothing. It was, Vane thought, watching the agitator pocket the silver and vanish into the dark. The finest kind of weapon, the kind that believed itself righteous while doing exactly what he paid it to do. High Priest Mir did believe himself righteous, and that was the part of him no one in this story would think to pity, because pity is not usually offered to men who burn other men's peace for a cause. Alone in the temple's inner sanctum, past midnight, with no congregation to perform his certainty for, Mir knelt before the old carved histories of the last Black Frost War, the one before the Purge, the one the Purge had been meant to prevent from ever happening again, and pressed his palm flat against stone worn smooth by 4 generations of frightened hands doing the same thing. "I do not hate the girl," he said quietly. To no one, to the stone, to whatever god still listened to a man who had stopped being sure of his own reasons. "I hate what follows her. There is a difference, and the difference is a war. My grandfather buried 3 brothers in that war. I have read every account of what a Moonrest bloodline loosed in the old king's hands, generations before the Purge, when the crown and that house stood together and mistook their bond for peace instead of the fuse it truly was. I am not building a lie. I am trying, with the only tools I have left, to stop a fire I have already watched burn once in every account that survived it." He did not open his eyes. "If I am wrong, let the gods forgive me after. I would rather beg forgiveness for cruelty than bury this kingdom in the grief I have already buried too much of my own family in." It was not righteousness. It was fear, dressed in scripture, certain of itself the way only fear ever manages to be certain. But it was not either a lie he told for gain. That distinction would matter later, though not yet, and not to the mob now gathering at the edges of the lower city with torches they had been given a reason, and a purse to carry. The final days moved faster than any of them. Even Torin, with all his king's instincts for danger, were ready for. Word reached the inner gates on the 4th night after Isla's fury that the lower city was gathering. Not a handful of frightened voices this time, but a river of them, torches multiplying at every crossroad they passed, the chant rising and falling like something with its own pulse. "Give us the cursed girl, give us the cursed girl, give us the cursed girl." Mir found her first. That had always been his plan, though even he might not have named it a plan out loud. He simply understood, with a strategist's instinct dressed as a shepherd's care, that the girl's own conscience was a weapon sharper than any mob, if he could only place it in the right hands. He found her in the narrow chapel, off the servants' wing, where she had gone to be somewhere that was not near the king, and he told her everything, in the cruelest possible frame with the gentle voice of a man delivering a mercy. "You should know the whole of it," he said, "before you decide anything for that man's sake. The king you sleep against, the man whose storm your hands have learned to quiet. His father did not merely fail to protect your house. He hunted it, room by room, cradle by cradle. Your mother ran with you, wrapped in nothing but a kitchen cloth, through snow that should have killed you both, because the alternative was staying to be found. She did not die of the cold, child. She died of a wound taken running. I have read the account. I did not write it to be cruel to you. I write only what is true. And it is crueler still that you have spent your whole life kneeling to change the bandages of the son of the man who orphaned you, and no one thought you deserved to know it plainly." His voice gentled further, which was somehow worse than if it had hardened. "Run, if you must. Or turn on him, if your grief demands it. Either would spare this city the fire that's coming for you. I would forgive you either choice." He wanted her broken open by grief, made reckless by it, driven to flee the citadel or to hate the man inside it. Because a fleeing girl proved the curse's guilt to the mob, and a girl who turned on her king broke him publicly in a way no army ever could. Either outcome served the same aim. He had misjudged, in one particular, the woman he was speaking to. Isla did not run. She sat with the truth the way she had sat with every wounded thing in her life, quietly, without flinching, letting it be exactly as ugly as it was, rather than making it smaller to survive it. She thought of her mother, a woman she had no memory of beyond wood smoke and wet wool, running through snow with a baby wrapped in a kitchen cloth, dying of a wound taken protecting the one thing she had left to protect. She thought of every sleeve she had ever pulled down over that scar, every question she had swallowed rather than ask, every silence she had mistaken, her whole life, for peace. And she thought of Torin's face in Orin's chamber, the guilt sitting there unhidden, 3 weeks of silence, finally named for what it was. She did not decide to hate him. That would have been easier, and she had never once in her whole life chosen the easier feeling over the true one. She walked out of the chapel into the cold, toward the sound of torches, and chanting at the inner gates, alone, because somewhere in the space between the priest's cruel truth and her own steady grief, she had arrived at a decision no one had handed her. If the kingdom wanted the cursed girl's head to stop its fear, she would give the kingdom a chance to look at her face and decide, for themselves, whether that fear had ever been about her at all. The inner gates of Frosthold, when she reached them, looked like a river had caught fire and forgotten how to stop moving. Torches multiplied across the frozen square in restless orange light, hundreds of them, the chant no longer scattered but unified now into one low continuous demand, "Give us the cursed girl," that beat against the citadel walls like something with fists. Guards lined the gate towers, silver-tipped spears leveled at a crowd too large and too afraid to be reasoned with by spears alone. Torin reached the gates a breath after she did. Having torn through the castle the moment word came, she had left the chapel unguarded. And what he found waiting for him at the wall was not a rescue that needed making. It was Isla, standing small and unshaking before a mob large enough to drown her, and the sight of her there without him undid something in his chest, faster than any blade at the tree line ever had. Isla. Her name came out of him, raw, stripped of every king's calm he had spent a lifetime perfecting. "Get back from the wall. Tell them the truth," she said without turning, her eyes on the torches, on the chanting faces she could not yet make out individually, but would, in a moment, have to. "Or I will. They will tear you apart before you finish the first sentence. Then I will finish quickly." She looked at him now, and there was no fury left in her voice, only the flat, clear calm of a decision already made. "You have spent 3 weeks protecting me by staying silent. Look where the silence brought us. I am done being protected by a lie." The mob's chant broke briefly into something closer to a roar as torches surged nearer the gate. And it was in that surge, the crowd's fear cresting past whatever leash the priest's careful sermons had kept it on, that the curse in Torin answered the danger the only way it knew how. Black veins bloomed dark beneath his skin, climbing past the bracer he no longer had time to hide them under, his jaw beginning its slow, terrible lengthening, the low storm sound rising in his chest that every soul at Frosthold had learned by now to fear. Guards on the wall swung silver-tipped spears toward their own king on pure trained instinct, uncertain in that instant whether they stood between the mob and their sovereign, or between their sovereign and everyone else. "Hold," Torin managed, through a jaw already half wolf's, the word coming out broken and low. "Hold your—" He did not finish it. The curse was rising faster than his voice could climb over it, and for the first time since the night of the ambush, there was no basin of hot water, no quiet chamber, no time at all. Isla turned back toward him. Every wolf in that square, guard and king and frightened lower city voice alike, understood in their blood what she was about to do. Because every wolf in the north had been raised on the same instinct. You do not go toward the storm. You do not put yourself inside the reach of a curse peeking past control. She walked toward him anyway, the crowd's roar falling away behind her into something closer to held breath, and when she reached him, she did not flinch from the gold gone bottomless in his eyes or the claws lengthening past his knuckles. She took his hand, the one with the black veins crawling darkest, the one he had spent weeks hiding under leather rather than let her see plainly. And she pressed her scarred wrist flat against his skin in front of the mob, in front of the guards, in front of every torch still burning at that gate. The black lines receded from beneath her touch, like tide pulling back from sand. It did not happen slowly. It happened the way a held breath finally lets go. All at once, the storm in him quieting from the point of contact outward until his jaw settled back into a man's jaw, and his eyes, gold a moment before, cleared to something achingly human, staring down at her hand against his skin, as if he had never once, in all his years of ruling, understood what stillness actually felt like until this exact moment. The square had gone silent enough to hear the torches burning, and then the Alpha King of the North, a title that had never in living memory bent its knee to anyone, not to enemy kings, not to his own councils, not even. Some whispered, to grief, knelt. Before the mob, before the wall of guards, uncertain where to point their spears, before the girl whose wrist still rested against his arm, as though neither of them had thought yet to move it. "I am the son of the man who ordered House Fenwick to the sword," he said, and his voice carried across that frozen square with none of a king's usual command in it, only the plain, unadorned weight of a confession finally spoken instead of buried. I knew what this woman carried the moment I saw the scar on her wrist, and I said nothing, because the truth was easier to survive in silence than to say aloud and answer for. My father feared her bloodline enough to burn it to the root. I feared the truth of what he'd done enough to let his silence live inside me a while longer. Both of those were cowardice, wearing a crown. I name it here, before you, because a debt inherited in silence does not disappear. It only waits for someone honest enough to say its name out loud. House Fenwick did not curse this kingdom. My house did, the day it decided a frightened crown was worth more than an innocent one. The confession alone would not have ended it. A kneeling king is a moving image, but a mob mid-riot does not disperse on eloquence, except that the frame around the whole fear campaign was already, in that same hour, collapsing from every direction at once. Wick, the stable boy, still shaking but steadier now with a guard captain's hand on his shoulder, had finally found the words to say what he'd swallowed for weeks. A hooded man's shape at the stable door, the night the horses died, and incense on the air a full breath before anyone arrived. Guards moving through the lower city, on Oren's urgent direction, had found, in the very purses of the loudest agitators at the granary fire, silver stamped with the unmistakable mark of House Vane. And Oren himself arrived at the gate breathless, a second sealed case under his arm. The hidden copy of every record he had ever kept twice, precisely for a night like this one. Proof enough, laid before the assembled council within the hour, that the omens had been paid for, not summoned. Lord Edric Vane's smile, when the guards came for him in his own chambers that same night, failed for the first time anyone at court could remember, faltering into something closer to a man doing sums that no longer balanced. High Priest Cassian Muir did not run. He knelt before his own temple's altar when they came, and said only, quietly, to the guard captain waiting to take him, that he stood by the fear, even as he surrendered to the law, because a man's theology does not become a lie simply because it was used cruelly. Though he would spend, he suspected, a long time afterward learning the difference between a fear worth holding and a fear worth burning a girl for. The square outside the inner gates did not empty all at once. Fear, once lit, takes time to bank down even after its fuel is proven false. But torch by torch, voice by voice, the chant that had demanded a cursed girl's head gave way to a quieter, harder thing to carry, the particular shame of a crowd realizing, together, exactly whose hands had been guiding its fear all along. Muir was stripped of his crimson robes before his own temple, 3 days later. In a ceremony no priest before him had ever had to endure, the incense that had once arrived in every room ahead of him now burned instead as an offering for the fire district families his sermons had helped set alight. Vane's council seat sat empty at the very next session, and stayed empty long enough that lesser men learned not to reach for it too eagerly. But the curse did not lift the moment the mob dispersed, because— and this is the part the kingdom would spend years afterward misunderstanding in every tavern retelling. Isla's touch had never actually been the cure. It had only ever been proof that mercy could still exist between two houses a crown had once tried to make enemies for good. What lifted the curse, slowly, over the seasons that followed, was the king's own hands finally doing what his father's silence had refused to do for a generation. Torrin opened the sealed archive to public record. Every burned name of House Fenwick read aloud in open court, so the North would remember what its fear had cost once already. He found the 3 surviving branches of families his father's purge had scattered rather than fully erased, and restored to them lands and names his own bloodline had stolen. He rebuilt, stone by stone at his own expense, the granary the fear campaign had burned in the lower city, and stood at its opening not as a king performing generosity, but as a man paying down a debt that had never once, in a generation, been named honestly until Isla forced its naming at the gates. The black vein still rose in him sometimes, in moments of high strain, a shadow of the curse his bloodline had earned through violence long before Isla Fenwick ever existed to soften it. But they receded faster now, and further, each season, not because her hand was a spell laid over his skin, but because a kingdom slowly learning to answer its old debts honestly is, it turns out, its own kind of quiet. She stayed at Frosthold. Not as a maid. That royal fiction had died the night at the gates, along with several other convenient fictions. But not either, as anything the court had a tidy word for yet. She and Torrin moved around each other in the months that followed with the particular carefulness of 2 people who had once trusted each other completely, broken that trust badly, and were now rebuilding it slower and truer than either had managed the first time. There were long silences between them that were not the comfortable kind. There were evenings she still changed his bandages out of habit, long after the wound at his ribs had healed clean, because the ritual itself had become a kind of language. Neither of them was ready to stop speaking. There was, eventually, an evening in the tower room where the storm had first gone quiet around her hands, when he finally told her plainly, without a king's polish on any of it, that he was sorry, not for the silence alone, but for every day he had let his fear of losing her cost her the truth she'd deserved from the start. And she let him say it all the way to the end before she forgave him, because that, too, was a kind of honesty she had learned to insist on. Oren, in the last of his sealed archive, had found one further thing he had not shown anyone at the height of the crisis, for fear it would be lost or twisted along with everything else. House Fenwick, in the old records, had kept a right of naming, a single sentence, spoken from one of that bloodline's kin to another. Thought lost entirely the winter the purge took every voice that once knew it. Oren had found it half-burned in a margin no one else had thought to read closely, and he had carried it quietly, the way he carried every fragile, true thing, until the day he judged it safe to hand to the one person left in the north who might have use for it. He gave it to Torrin on a morning gray with new snow, and said nothing else about it, because some gifts do not need instruction. The chamber where Isla slept now was not the lower servants' wing. That, too, had changed, quietly, without ceremony, the way most true changes in that castle now happened. She had fallen asleep by the fire with a book still open on her lap, the particular deep sleep of someone who has finally, after a hard season, stopped bracing for the next blow. Torrin stood in the doorway a long moment simply watching her breathe, the firelight moving gold across her hair the way it had moved that first frozen dawn across the throne hall floor. And he thought of the law the whole kingdom now repeated, without needing to be told twice, that no one wakes the maid sleeping over the Alpha King's heart, on pain of his fury. He crossed the room, knelt beside her chair, and woke her gently himself, because there was one thing he had waited the length of this entire story to ask her, while she was awake to hear it asked. She stirred, blinking against the firelight, already half smiling before she was fully awake, because some part of her had learned by now what his hand near hers usually meant. He said the sentence Oren had found, the one buried in half-burned margins, for a generation, the naming right of a bloodline the North had tried to erase, and could not fully manage. 4 plain words in the old tongue of her mother's house. Words she had never once heard spoken aloud in her life, and had no way of knowing she had been waiting, without knowing it, her whole life to hear. She did not ask him to translate them. She understood them anyway. The way you understand a thing your blood has always known before your mind caught up to it. And when he finished speaking, she reached up and touched his jaw, right where the black veins had once crawled darkest, and kissed him. Once, unhurried, the whole weight of everything neither of them had said plainly finally spoken in the simplest way 2 people have for saying it. Outside the tower window, the North was quiet. No bells rang that had not been rung by human hands, no fires burned that anyone had not lit on purpose. For warmth, the way fires are meant to be lit. A curse a generation in the making does not end because one wrist meets one storm and stills it. It ends the slow way. A name spoken aloud in open court, a granary rebuilt stone by stone. A king who finally stopped inheriting his father's silence and started paying, instead, the actual debt. But if you had asked anyone in Frosthold that winter what they remembered of the whole affair, the omens, the mob, the priest's incense, the council noble's ruined smile, they would tell you, almost every one of them, the same single image, the one the whole kingdom had agreed, without discussing it, to keep. A maid asleep on the chest of the most feared man in the North, and a king who, when everyone else in the world was too afraid to come near him, chose instead to guard her sleep like the only law worth keeping.